Welcome to the Side Chat Podcast. This is part 2 of the ME262. First off, I'd like to apologize for this taking so long to get published to you. I had a hurricane hit right in the middle of it, plus a personal injury to my head that kept me from being able to read for about a month, and then I know Bismarck had a couple emergencies pop in there, so it's been a kind of a scheduling nightmare. I plan on having the next podcast out much sooner. I'm aiming for middle of December, and we're going to be doing it on the TBF Avenger. So if you'd like to send in TBF Avenger gameplay, that would help me out greatly in getting the video out sooner to you. And before we begin, I want to thank everybody who sent in ME262 footage to make this video possible. So in our last podcast, we talked about the design and development of the ME262 and a lot of the politics that surrounded it. This one will be focusing on production and combat. And we're going to start off talking about basically the 8th Air Force bombing the measurement factories into the Stone Age. The 8th Air Force made a huge push to basically ground the German Air Force, and they did a devastating amount of damage. During that raid, they took out basically the entire ME262 production facility. A lot of the machine tooling did make it through, and they were able to recover some of the 262 jigs that were used to make the fuselage. After that main facility was destroyed, they moved production to several other locations in about a 100-mile radius. I know it was several other countries as well.
Yeah, so essentially that's a good explanation of what happened. The first real raid that hits Messerschmitt already happens in August 1943, and that's when the Messerschmitt GmbH is hit at Regensburg, and that essentially gives Messerschmitt the impetus to think about decentralizing his production facilities, because he is essentially centralized around Regensburg and Augsburg. However, in 1943, we're talking about the summer of 1943, there is not a lot of progress being made. In February 44, then, this is where the 8th Air Force really hits Augsburg, and there is nothing really that can be salvaged out of, well, the tooling, obviously, as you said, but the factory and the facility is completely destroyed. And obviously, at this point, the Germans have realized if we keep on producing our aircraft in these kind of central spots, in these factories, as you would, imagine a factory with a chimney and outdoors and so on, we are going to get bombed into the Stone Age, and we're not going to be able to produce. So what ends up happening is that if you have a basic grasp of German geography and you look at the south of Germany, you have Stuttgart, which is the capital of Swabia, and you have Munich, which is the capital of Bavaria. And between those two major cities, you have a autobahn, and it runs through Ulm and goes then on towards Munich. Around that autobahn, this is where this kind of hotspot of the production develops for the 262. You have very close to the autobahn, you have around 20 smaller workshops that are being set up, and then from that, you expand from that in a bigger radius, roughly, like Bo says, 100 miles, going into Austria with with one or two shops, and even into the east of Bavaria. And around this autobahn really becomes the focal point of the 262 production. And this really starts immediately after Augsburg is hit in February 44. And the production first is centralized around Leipheim, which is a major German airport, which is also kind of in the middle of the whole spiderweb that is going to be established. And that already starts in March and April 44. However, this is not a production as you would imagine it in a big factory or even in a hangar. A lot of this production is done outdoors. And in fact, it's quite interesting to look at how these the parts of the aircraft are being sent to this place. For example, the wings, this is they are produced in Stuttgart in a tunnel, in an autobahn tunnel that has been commissioned for this. Then you have the fuselages, which come from a forest near Passau. And then you have the engines, which are being produced more or less locally around Leipheim airport. So you have a lot of vital parts being sent along the autobahn towards Leipheim, this kind of centralized position, which even though this is where all the 262s are being produced, they are still essentially just putting the aircraft together, and the aircraft is produced in many different parts around that area.
And as you can imagine, this makes production painfully slow.
And even the interesting thing is the Americans actually react to this quite fast. And already in April 44, and production has been running around there for about 3 weeks now, they already attacked this airfield, and 50 Me-262s that have been built and that are ready to go are completely destroyed on the ground. And you can see the kind of difficulties the Germans have, because they need to be next to a autobahn or an airfield, because these 262s obviously have to be flown for the first time, checking that everything goes well, and then they have to be sent off to the different squadrons. So you need to have this very logistically intensive area there where you can actually use this jet, because it needs a very, very long airstrip. Normal airfields at that time don't have the airstrip that is required, so the autobahn helps, because there's this one piece that is extremely long. And of course, Leipheim itself, the airport, was also more or bigger than the usual airports in the area.
Now, long term, the Germans had a plan to build Me-262s underground. They started digging out these gigantic facilities they basically rounded up civilians or anybody they could find and put them into these big dark facilities with shovels and pickaxes, working them 16 hours a day. And the idea was that they would dig in basically smaller tunnels underneath these old quarries or mines or hills or wherever they could find. And basically all these small tunnels would feed into one big tunnel. That would be the idea of how they're going to centralize the Me-262 production.
I mean, this is incredibly important, because the Germans, they do realize that even though they have decentralized their production, and even though this decentralization is working to a degree, it is not the same as centralizing the production in one area and pumping out one 262 after the other. And as Bo was saying, they have these grand plans of these structures purpose-built just for 262 production. There's going to be 2 that are planned to be built both in the east and in the west of Munich, very close to that city actually. And both factories are supposed to be able to output 1,200 262s a year once completed. Now, they never really get completed. One of the interesting design choices the Germans actually had is that these production facilities would be built in on different floors, right? And on the top floor, the 262 would be finished, and the top floor would also act as sort of an airstrip. But this would only be for takeoff, and the 262s in the imagination of the Germans would take off. The airstrip would be too short, so they would have rocket boosted assisted takeoff, and they would take off and then fly to the airfields where they would have their proper calibration flights and then being transferred to the actual Geschwaders. However, before these factories are completed, they are being essentially overrun by the Americans. The Americans capture a lot of tooling, they capture a lot of parts, and in one factory, in fact, in Thuringia, which is also a kind of, it's to the north of Bavaria, really, another little regional state of Germany. There is also a production being set up there. In fact, interestingly enough, that factory actually has the name of Hermann Göring. And the Americans capture that factory, and there is enough tools there and enough pieces there to build 5 Me-262s, which they essentially instruct the workers that are there to build for them, and they have 5 brand new Me-262s which they can look at and marvel in this slight advance. Well, big advance in aviation, but from the production quality, perhaps not ideal yet.
So I think that covers basically all we're going to talk about production. We just want to kind of paint you a picture of why why there was trouble getting 262s to the squadrons that we're about to talk about.
Yeah, there's maybe one statistic that we can add to this. All in all, roughly 1,400 262s are built in Germany at that time, in about a production run of 13 months, so just more than a year. 500 of those are lost before they actually arrive to the squadrons, and this is due to bombing or to accidents, but mainly it's because of bombing. And in fact, actually 600 get lost, but 100 can be salvaged and put back together. So 500 are lost before they can even have their calibration flight. So all in all, only 900 are fit to service or ready for service. And then, of course, you have training accidents and so on. So that number decreases once again.
The first squadron that was established was ZJ-26. It was 8 pilots that were basically going to be building the tactics and strategies that were going to be used for the Me-262. These individuals found a lot of issues with the early 262s that were given to them. The aircraft had bad welding, it had cracks in the elevator push rods, they had incorrect fluid levels, wrong oil levels, and other issues. So instead of spending more time flying and developing Me-262 tactics, their aircraft spent most of the time in maintenance, which also delayed the Me-262 program even further.
Yeah, so the pilots that were drawn from JG-26, Zerstörergeschwader 26, these guys flew Messerschmitt 410s before that, and before that they flew 110. So they're coming from a twin-engine aircraft to a jet aircraft. However, because they are considered to be relatively well-trained pilots at this point in time, because twin-engine aircraft obviously takes more effort to train than a single-engine aircraft, they are considered to be a good basis on which to train. And a lot of these pilots are also then being groomed to become trainers on these aircraft, but with the bad production quality and the lack of fuel and a lot of accidents happening, the actual number of these pilots decreases quite significantly.
The main tactic that they developed during their time was basically bouncing an aircraft and then extending away and getting enough distance to turn around and hit it again. Basic energy fighting, but that's the tactic that they wanted to teach the other 262 pilots, was to hit with speed and then just basically speed, use your speed to your advantage and defensive.
Yeah, this is very important to remember, is that a lot of fighter pilots at this time in time, while there's this what we nowadays call boom and zooming and energy fighting and so on, was very much established, they were still used to maneuvering against enemy aircraft, especially fighter aircraft. However, with the 262, the way you have to engage the enemy changes significantly. And like Bo said, the focus was on getting speed, making your run, shoot, and then just scoot, extend, get that distance, look around, evaluate your surroundings, and hit the enemy again once you know you're safe. What was really one of the primary problems with the 262 is that once it started maneuvering against enemy aircraft, it was essentially done for. There's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, acceleration problems. The 262 did not accelerate that well. Once it got up to speed, that was a different matter entirely, but from going from low to high speed was a problem. And as well as that, the enemy pilots were always in superior numbers. So once a 262 lost its speed, even if it can perhaps defeat one pilot in a maneuver battle or even two pilots, there's always going to be that third or that fourth pilot that can just sneak in on its six and blast it with 50 cals or 20 millimeter cannons, but depending on what aircraft that he's obviously flying.
First combat of the Me-262 is kind of debated. There's two dates that pop up when you kind of research this. The first one is July 18th. There is a Me-262 left to attack a U.S. bomber formation, but it never returned. U.S. reports stated that he was shot down by 15 P-51 Mustangs. The Germans' reports basically say that the aircraft more likely crashed due to technical issues. The pilot did bail, but he was too low. Nobody really knows what happened to the aircraft other than the U.S. reports. The date that's basically noted, though, more as being the first engagement is on July 25th, where a Mosquito from 544 Squadron was flying at 30,000 feet, and Mosquitoes were basically one of the fastest aircraft in the air at that time. The radio operator informed that there was something closing quickly on them, and that was quite a shock to them that something was closing on a Mosquito from the 6. The Mosquito waited for the aircraft to get basically as close as possible, and then did a maneuver to make the Me-262 overshoot. The 262 fired. They could see 30 mil flying over the top of their canopy. The 262 kept doing turns inside of it, and eventually they were able to hide in a cloud, and the aircraft disengaged. The Mosquito pilot and his radio operator had no idea what the hell they just encountered. They got back and reported it to the British and the Americans, and, well, let's just say higher command knew that Me-262s and Me-163s existed long before this, but they weren't notifying people. So this was the first time that an actual pilot engaged one. The U.S. and British had fairly well documented aerial surveillance of Me-262s before this point, so this is the first time servicemen actually had to encounter the aircraft. Combat kept ramping up into August. There was a handful of victories against recon Spitfires and Mosquitoes. The Allies became more and more aware of the jet aircraft and the rocket aircraft that they were facing. So there was actually an operation that they held over in England where they took a B-24 squadron and took 4 British Meteors and basically did mock engagements against jet fighters. And during this time, they were trying to figure out how could they better protect bombers. The Meteors during their mock gun runs basically had no issue killing B-24s from the front. They would go high and they attack the aircraft head on, where the B-24 was basically not able to protect itself. The aircraft that they had covering them was held at about 5,000 feet above them. The P-51s could not engage the Meteors. So then they decided, well, can we push the P-51s to 5,000 and 10,000 feet? Well, you can't get a P-51 really 10,000 feet above B-24 because the service ceiling won't allow it. So they had to basically say more aircraft. The only thing they could come up with was put the P-51s far ahead of the bombers to try to make a screen.
It's actually quite interesting to see how the Americans and the Allies essentially reacted to this, and how they knew about the developments and how that then translated into trying to find countermeasures quite early on, and what kind of countermeasures were implemented. Now, the Germans themselves, like we said, with Erprobungskommando 262, 262 auf Deutsch, in German, those are, of course, the pilots that the Bo talked about earlier with Zerstörergeschwader 26, ZG-26. They are by now pretty much established as the Ergänzungsjagdgeschwader 2. You go through a couple of phases as well, where you start then going into the operational measures against B-17s and against Allied bombings. And this is where we start, I guess, just after the Americans and the Brits have started to establish their first primary countermeasures against it. So we're speaking around September, October 44, when some people might know this one, Commando Novotny was essentially established.
And we'll get to Commando Novotny in a minute. There's another unit that we probably should cover first before we get to that one, which is KG-51. If you remember in our last podcast, we mentioned how Hitler ordered in May of 1944 that all 262s were to be transferred to bomber operations. And then Commander Novotny is a fighter squadron that basically came around in the fall when they had clearance after they realized that the Me-262 as a bomber was a nightmare. So KG-51 was a pretty famous unit. It went from operating Ju-88s to Me-410s. They had a lot of success during the Battle of Britain. Now these bomber pilots were being retrained on how to fly a 262. On July 10th, 12 pilots and 6 262s started the program. 4 days after they first started this, a 262 crashed on a practice bombing run. Real quickly, the 262 does not like to dive. When the Me-262 is in a dive, it reaches somewhere around 900 kmh. And the aircraft loses airflow over the wings, and then it locks up, and a bunch of other issues happen where controls don't respond, and then it goes flat into the ground. This is an issue they worked on until the last days of the war. There was not enough understanding about aerodynamics at the time to make an aircraft that could do that.
Yeah, the Germans eventually understood this. Obviously, the pilots understood it pretty quickly. The head honchos maybe were a little bit slower to grasp it, perhaps. Also because of the political implications that we talked about in the earlier podcast, with rivalries, for example, between the German Bomber Command and German Fighter Command. With KG-51, this is really a celebrated kind of Kampfgeschwader bomber wing for the Germans. It's also known as the Edelweiss-Geschwader, and some of the most experienced pilots, bomber pilots, are in this Geschwader. Their bombers, their 262s, which are first time based in Juvincourt, this is actually in France, in summer 1944, are eventually by the fall and winter of 1944 transformed into fighters. So they give it up completely of trying to strap bombs to this plane, and these bomber pilots then become essentially fighter pilots.
The Me-262, besides not being able to dive bomb, so then it had to basically do loft bombing or shallow angle bombing. So the pilots then basically had about 4 flights under their belt, and they were sent into operation. Their training was over. It's insane to think somebody's being put into operation status, only having 4 flights on an aircraft, let alone being a jet aircraft. That is not acceptable by any standard.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we often see on the internet is people saying German pilots were very good and so on and so forth. By this point in time, while they were very good pilots, the German Luftwaffe has been essentially bled dry by the experiences since 1939. So a lot of these pilots, while they are more or less competent still with the aircraft that they were initially trained on, for example, with KG-51, that would be bombers, now putting them into a jet aircraft and having them just go at it without any sort of training essentially makes them rookies once again. They have an understanding how to fly aircraft, of course, but they don't know how to operate an aircraft of this design and technology. So this is where a lot of accidents happen, a lot of tragic accidents happen, and you can really tell from the early losses that the Germans are experiencing that it's really not too much the Americans or the Brits. It's really just the plane, which they are not trained properly to fly, because they cannot be trained properly to fly because there's fuel shortages, there's shortages in trainers or instructors that can do it, and they are rushed to the front simply because there is an absolute need and necessity to have people up on the front lines that do something, just anything, to stop the advance into the Reich.
As Bismarck said, there was a lot of aircraft that was lost on takeoff and landing due to technical issues or training issues or pilot error, whatever you want to call it. When they actually were able to hit the target, they were generally swarmed by P-51s or P-47s or Tempest. The Me-262 handled horrible with a bomb on it, and every time a pilot basically turned, the Allied aircraft had no problem catching that aircraft and taking it out. I would call it below average performance for KG-51, and it was at no fault to the pilots. It was just the worst possible situation you could be put into as a bomber pilot.
The thing is, you have to remember that even though the 262 is fast, when you go into a bombing run, even whether it's dive bombing, skip bombing, or just whatever kind of bombing, at some point you're going to be vulnerable. It's either going to be on your approach or it's going to be on your egress. There is at some point you will have to maneuver. At some point you will have to do something that puts you either towards the target or away from the target. And those are the moments where somebody can catch up with you. And even though if the Me-262 is going at blistering speeds, if there's a Mustang or a Tempest diving on it, for a short duration, provided that the pilot times it right and gets the correct angle and had a good initial position, he can stay on the tail of a 262 for enough time to get a couple of shots off. Now, eventually, he's going to lose that advantage, and the distance is going to be drawn out. The 262 is going to be able to run away. But if he has a good, depending on how his positioning was and how he timed it, he has a good 5 to 20 seconds to get a shot off. And in those moments, when you hit the engine of the 262, or if the 262 panics, the pilot panics, and he maneuvers, he's a gunner.
In early November, it became evident to Hitler that the 262 was being wasted as a bomber, and he finally gave permission for the 262s to be used as a fighter. And that's where Commando Novotny comes in.
Commando Novotny essentially comes out of the experiences also by Erprobungskommando 262, which was based in Lechfeld, Bavarian airfield. And it really sets up around September, October 1944. Now, next to this one, there's also the Ergänzungsjagdgeschwader 2, which is being set up. But Commando Novotny really is a short-lived kind of, well, you wouldn't really call it the Jagdgeschwader fighter wing, but it's a kind of small, short-lived command with 262s. And it eventually, it's being redesignated into the Dritte Staffel Jagdgeschwader 7, Novotny. This is because the commander of Commando Novotny dies in essentially mysterious circumstances, let's say, more or less. We can piece it together, but
I read through 3 different sources, and I can kind of piece together what those 3 said about Novotny. Walter Novotny was a very beloved individual. He was of course, the whole thing was named after him. He was a great pilot, a tremendous pilot, but he was also, besides that, a really good administrator. Every second that he wasn't in the air, he was on the phone with Messerschmitt, with logistics. He was getting more ground crew, he was getting radar, he was getting airfields taken care of, he was securing fuel. He basically was the force driving this entire unit. Novotny and Galland and a couple other personnel were basically standing around the radio listening to 2 Me-262s that went up. The first Me-262 went down rather quickly. The second Me-262 radio back that he was hit, they said that they were able to get 2 enemy aircraft for their 2 Me-262s. Eyewitness accounts say that Novotny's face turned to pure anger. He told his driver to go get his car. Galland told him that in no circumstances are you going up there, stay here. He defied that order, got in his car, went to his Me-262, and took off by himself. He then shot down what believed to be 3 aircraft. He radioed back, I got 3 aircraft, I'm going down. There's a bunch of garbled messages. Goland and everybody else ran outside the building that they were in, and they saw an Me-262 plummeting straight down. They went to the aircraft, and it was just a crater. To my knowledge, his body was never really recovered. It was just a half-torn parachute.
Yeah, there is this theory that he tried to bail and he was either too low, or when he bailed, that his parachute got entangled into his tail or something, and that kind of dragged him into his death.
U.S. reports say that there was over 30 P-51s engaging him.
Yeah, that's good odds right there. Yeah.
Once he died, Golan was visibly upset. They said that he was actually crying when he left. This was a good friend of his. Deactivated the entire unit and sent it back for retraining and restructuring.
Yeah, and after this death, essentially the Kommando Novotny is, as Bo says, completely dissolved. And then in November of that year, 1944, you have the Jagdgeschwader 7 Novotny that is being established under the command of Oberst Johannes Steinhoff. This is also quite a celebrated figure amongst the German fighter pilots. And these guys continue to fight until more or less the end of the war, the last couple of days of the war. And they also have severe problems in trying to get well-trained pilots. In fact, they don't really have any well-trained pilots when it comes to the actual training on the 262. They have, while they get a good amount of new aircraft, they don't get enough maintenance tools, they don't get enough replacement parts, they don't get enough fuel, which is really the big kicker, because fuel allows you to both train and engage the enemy, and they are suffering quite a substantial amount of losses. And even though they get a somewhat regular supply of 262s, there are sometimes times when they suffer losses, and then for a week or two they don't get any replacements, and then suddenly 5 or 6 262s are being sent there, and then they lose 3 of them immediately. And yeah, it's once again a very, very tragic time for these pilots.
Well, at this time, too, it's important to note that they actually didn't have enough pilots to transfer the Me-262s from the factory to the units. So they started transferring this. This hurts my head in terms of efficiency, but they figured out this is the best way they could do it. They would do a test flight at the factory. They would take the aircraft apart, put it on a train, ship it to the airfield that it's supposed to go to, reassemble the aircraft there, and then do another test flight and calibration there.
Yeah, or you had this idea that you would send the pilots to the factory, then they would take the aircraft to the airfield and to the Geschwader, and then they would be sent back to the factory and take another one and so on. You had all those kind of logistical, nightmarish ideas that under normal circumstances make absolutely no sense whatsoever, but given the situation, it is the best that I can do.
Throughout 1944, the RAF's Mosquito was a massive problem for the Germans. So Germany called on one of its most successful night fighter aces, Lieutenant Kurt Welter, which is, I think, one of my favorite people. So they enlisted his help. He test flew 2 aircraft that he had interest in, the Me-262 and the Arado 234. I think he had more interest for the Arado 234, but there's 2 issues. A was handling, and B, he was terrified of the full glass cockpit that was on the Arado. They have to get extremely close in night fighting, and he was terrified of the debris coming from an enemy aircraft that was being shot down, basically killing the pilot in the Arado. So he went for the Me-262. They did have plans to build, I believe, the Arado 234P, which was supposed to be a night fighter variant with an armored cockpit, but I don't think that actually ever really became anything. His first kill in a night fighter Me-262 was on a Mosquito on November 28. He secured a few more kills between December and January. More of his pilots that were basically assigned to him started going up.
Yeah, this is with Kommando Welter, which was essentially his command, attached to Nachtjagdgeschwader 11. These guys, after this first initial kill that Welter did, he had a lot of support in the high command. And because the Mosquito was such a annoying and really crucial part also of the RAF bombing campaign at night, that they really needed something that can catch that thing and shoot it down. And after this kill, immediately in December 44, just a few days after that kill, he's allowed to set up his command, Kommando Welter. Initially, it's a one-man show. He doesn't have anybody else working for him. It's just him, and in the Gruppe, or the command, essentially only really exists on paper, in that there is actually no supporting personnel. Now, it does increase eventually, and one of the important things to remember is that Initially, he flew with an Me-262 that was prepped for daytime operation. And he only had a few modifications made to it to allow him to do night missions. And then eventually he received a Me-262B1A-U1, which was the famous kind of one with the radar dish up front, radar antennas up front, and so on. But as Bo says, by February, March, Kommando Welter essentially disintegrates. He's officially credited with 35 kills during that time, and his total tally stands at around 65, I believe. However, I think there has been some recent investigation of his kill claims, and it seems that some of the claims that he made, probably in good faith, actually got away in the end, and the RAF didn't lose as many mosquitoes that we usually believe. But it's still something that is, aerial victories is a minefield of contention, so we will never be absolutely sure.
The biggest foe for the Me-262s as a night fighter was Halifax and Lancaster's rear turrets. The rear turrets just chewed up 262s when they went in for attack runs. Welter wanted, he had all these crazy ideas. I'm not going to go into very much into variants because there's literally like 100 plus. There may be 1,000 on paper for Me-262s. Welter alone, I think, had probably 40 different variants that he came up with. He had a 2-seater Me-262, and then the one that just baffles my mind was a 3-seater Me-262. But this guy, though, as a pilot, was one of the best.
Yeah, and speaking of one of the best, we should probably also obviously mention Jagdverband 44, which is Galland's little command. So with Jagdgeschwader 7, Novotny already being essentially doing their job. So with Jagdgeschwader 7, Novotny already being established as a fighter wing or a fighter group within a wing, you now have also from February 45, this is very late in the war, Jagdverband 44. Now Jagdverband 44 is an anomaly. It is a completely unorthodox organization within the Luftwaffe. And in fact, you can even make the argument that it was an organization that was standing outside the Luftwaffe. What happened is that with the so-called fighter pilots mutiny, a lot of big names in the fighter pilot ranks lost their support within the German political and military structure. And this includes people also like Steinhoff and, of course, Galland. And they are fired from their post. They are sent into, more or less exile. And eventually, Galland somehow is able to secure the promise to be able to establish a command of 262s alone. However, he's given no official support. He has to organize his own planes, he has to organize his own crews, he has to organize his own support structure, he has to organize his own vehicles, he has to organize his own airfields, everything that you could imagine that needs to go into establishing a command. He has to procure himself outside.
Sorry to interrupt you. It was Hitler who approved of it. That's yes. How he got clearance to do that.
Speer essentially went to Hitler, and Hitler then said, okay, let's give him this command. And he collected a lot of old-time friends, and this is sometimes known also as the pool of the aces, where apparently there was a joke going around, you needed a Knight's Cross to be able to apply there. But you had pilots like Backhorn, Steinhoff, of course, Kopinski, and so on. So and those guys did relatively well with the 262s actually. But again, it comes very late between February and April 45. And even before the war officially ends, the base is essentially overrun by the Americans. And the actual time frame that they can operate is very minimal, and they always, I think the maximum amount of operational 262s they had at any given point in time was maybe 12, and they needed support by 109s and Focke-Wulfs to be able to actually take off on land. But they are doing some good work, and this is probably where this kind of success stories from the 262s come from. It's from this command rather than the other ones, which went through really, really tragic times.
That airfield that they operated at was bombed on a daily basis. Pilots that took off from there basically assumed that the airfield was not going to be in existence when they came back.
Yeah, I mean, the Americans were focusing a lot of their attention on this particular airfield once they realized what was going on. And this is, I guess, where we can also go into some of the very late war countermeasures that the Americans had with their P-51s, essentially hunting down single 262s over the airfields and so on. Now, what I already alluded to is that the Germans tried to cover takeoff and landing with 109s and Focke-Wulfs. And if you believe it or not, I believe Jagdverband 44, some of the aircraft that were covering them on takeoff and landing were actually Doras, like D9, Focke-Wulf D9. So this is also creme de la creme, essentially what the Germans had. But they're using this to save the 262. And just as a minor fact here and tidbit, if you ever see a camo scheme of a Dora and it has a red undercoat on the bottom side of the wings and the fuselage, then this is one of those Doras that was used as an airfield protection vehicle for the 262s.
If you want to know more about Goland's unit, there's a couple great books. Goland has a book that he published, and then there's a book that was published a few years ago called The Higher Call. So there's a lot of good published information about these pilots and their lives and what they went through. And I strongly encourage you to pick up either A Higher Call or Goland's book.
The first and the last in English.
The first and the last. The R4Ms were developed, and it's a crazy weapon system. 24 rockets on each wing. There's basically 2 boxes of 12 that were mounted. And the reason why these things were very important to the Germans was they needed a weapon system that could engage aircraft at longer range. As silly as this may sound, the 30mm Mk108s, which are devastating, were kind of outdated for a jet aircraft. And it made the Me-262 vulnerable because they had to get so close to the aircraft that they had to shoot.
And the other option that they had, that sometimes gets referenced, the 50mm cannon, is completely impractical. There's a reason why it wasn't used beyond, I think, 1 or 2 in Galan's unit, and they never really flew with those things because it's completely impractical.
One 50mm Me-262 that was operational, and there was a second one that was built as a prototype that was never finished.
Yes.
With a newer version of the cannon. Let me wrap up with the R4Ms, and then I have an interesting story about the 50mm Me-262. So the R4Ms had an engagement range of about 1,500 meters. The first time they went out, it was an instant success. They were usually able to take down 1 to 2 planes per volley because the bomber formation was so tight. You just launch a volley of 48 rockets. You have 4 Me-262s with 48 rockets, 200 rockets flying at bombers. It's insane how much damage these things did. And the pilots said that when a bomber was hit with these things, it just turned into confetti. It was just a gigantic explosion. They actually had trouble telling how many planes they hit because it was just fire everywhere. This is something that they liked and actually was very successful. I know that Goland had several kills with these rockets himself. So these things are documented as actually being a really great weapons platform.
They came in very late, though. That's the problem.
Yeah. It was actually never approved by the German military.
Yeah.
They actually sidestepped all the bureaucracy and had these things built
By themselves, pretty much.
And then the company that built the actual launcher, the wooden launcher, was 2 furniture companies. They actually sidestepped Messerschmitt altogether and went to local furniture companies to do this.
This was kind of a blessing in disguise because the fact that Jagdverband 44 was completely outside of the jurisdiction of the Luftwaffe, they could do this kind of stuff.
So the 50mm Me-262, it was fired twice on the ground. It worked. They took it up in 2 trial flights. It was able to fire through all its ammo. Perfect, no problem. They took it into combat. It jammed. Took it into combat again. It jammed. And then that's when they tried to move to the newer, basically lighter weight, more reliable 50mm cannon, and that Me-262 was never really finished. The first one, though, was actually one of the 12 aircraft that was really captured by the Americans. It was actually the last Me-262 to be flown out of Germany into France when it was being transported back to the States. That poor aircraft, it took off. They actually talked about removing the cannon and the ammo to try to save weight because it was so kind of sketchy. The aircraft took off, and the pilot during his flight said he heard a loud explosion. He looked over to his wing, and he saw flames coming up through the wing. If I crash this aircraft, the Americans are going to blame me for destroying it so they can't have their war trophy. If I don't bail out of this aircraft, I'm going to die. The aircraft crashed. The pilot slammed his leg into the fuselage. His parachute, he bailed out about 900 kmh, and the American parachute he was using was rated at 600. So the thing just went to shreds, and he landed. He woke up and on somebody's couch with a bunch of women and men around him. His jacket that he was wearing burned up with all his paperwork in it, saying that he was part of the American project, and he had no papers or documentation, and so he purposely didn't speak any German because he didn't know how the French would react to a German pilot being in their house a couple of months after the war. He was eventually able to get back to the Americans, and everything was smoothed out, but that's what happened to the only real 50mm Me-262. The only real variant I think that we should focus on is the rocket-assisted interceptor, if you want to touch on that.
Heimatschützer, the ones that didn't get built. And then with the Heimatschützer, there were also some other proposed changes to the aircraft that would have probably made it a better design. A lot of people give a lot of credit to the Me-262 as a design itself. However, it was somewhat flawed as a jet, and also Messerschmitt knew this. For example, the basic change that, for example, needed to be done, and Messerschmitt actually had planned this, is to sweep the wings back more to what we would then later on see, for example, with the Sabre and the MiG, because with the way the wings were formed in the operational 262s was detrimental to the aircraft's performance. And there were a lot of these small little changes that needed to be done to actually make it into a really, really good aircraft. But given the situation that Germany found itself in late 44, that obviously never materialized.
The undercarriage needed to be completely reworked. The tires and the landing gear was not strong enough for the aircraft on takeoff and landing, especially when it was loaded down with bombs. Another big issue that the fighter pilots constantly complained about was that the flight stick itself was too short, and it did not allow them to get the leverage that they needed for the flight controls.
Yeah, this is probably a testimony to also how little time there was really to smooth out problems and get production variants going one after the other with incremental improvements to them. You see a lot of these kind of unique prototypes that the Germans built. The 50mm would be a perfect example there, with the 262 fuselage. But they branched out into all kinds of things that they could have done, and eventually having maybe focused just on improving the fighter variant would have been a better call. But then again, we can't really place ourselves in their shoes.
When the Americans captured, like I said, the 12 Me-262s at facility, the ground crew and the engineers and a lot of the people that worked on it shared the information with the Americans, and a lot of the information that they learned, especially about reaching near the sound barrier, was continued to be worked on as a collaboration between those Germans and an American team, and that's lead to Chuck Yeager's flight of breaking the sound barrier. The 262 has influenced aviation, and today, like what we talked about, is it's GMO's axial flow engines.
I mean, the Americans and the Allies as a whole could learn a lot by the 262 simply because they didn't have to go through those teething problems that the Germans had experienced initially. Obviously, there were also jet projects in all these countries. You had the Meteor, of course, in the UK that was already operational, and I think you also had quite a number of projects in the US. But by just learning from the German experiences, you stopped yourself from making perhaps the same mistakes, or you could see what has potential, what doesn't work, where can we improve things, and what can we incorporate into our own planes.
Once again, big thanks to Bismarck for being here today. I strongly encourage you to check out his channel. He's doing a lot of great work with military aviation history. It's always a pleasure to have him here on this channel.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
Once again, I'm going to be doing the next podcast on the Avenger, the TBM Avenger. So if you want to send in some War Thunder footage of your Avenger, either ground forces, attacking tanks or in the air, that would be fantastic. That's a great way to get your stuff on the channel. And I'll try to have that to you as soon as possible.
It's a great and very important aircraft as well.
Thank you for listening, and we will answer any questions that you have in the comments to the best of our ability. Have a great day.
See you. Bye-bye.